Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe into a castle where the fire crackles and the trenches are being stacked for a feast unlike any you'd want to replicate. The walls are damp, the air smells like a mash of wet wool, barley, and ambition. And you're standing right at the edge of a grand medieval banquet. You're wrapped in a cloak that hasn't been dry since October, trying not to trip over a goose waddling past your boots. Welcome to dinner. Now, you might think attending a medieval feast sounds like an enchanted experience. Roast meats, sweet meats, the rhythmic thump of a hurdy-gurdy in the background. But brace yourself. These banquets were as much about spectacle as they were about sustenance, and often the sustenance part was, well, a bit medieval. If you survive this evening without indigestion or insult, you deserve your own family crest. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location and local time down below. I promise I read them all, even the ones at 3 a.m. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward into the long hall, its high ceiling disappearing into shadows. Tapestries hang like heavy sighs on the wall, their colors dulled by smoke. 100 candles flicker in iron sconces, casting wobbly halos on damp stone. At the center of the room sits a grand table, covered in linen stiff with grease and embroidered with the family crest of someone who likely hasn't washed their hands since last Lent. Servants dart about like frantic starlings, arms heavy with trenches, stale slabs of day-old bread meant to double as plates. You pick one up, tap it against the table, and hear a dull funk. Definitely edible. In theory. The first course is announced by a trumpet blast so sharp you nearly spill your cider. A steward emerges with a steaming cauldron of pottage, something between stew and hope. It smells of barley, leeks, and resignation. A ladle sloshes a portion into your trencher, splattering your sleeve. It's hot. That's the best you can say. Across the table, a noblewoman eyes her spoon like it owes her money. You mimic her polite sniff, catching a whiff of salt pork that might have once been pork and might have once been salt. The texture is thick, gelatinous, oddly comforting in a "this will coat your ribs for winter" kind of way. A page boy runs past, trailing herbs, literal branches of rosemary tied to his belt for aroma rather than seasoning. You ask yourself, not for the last time, why nobody uses forks. Beside your trencher sits a dull-bladed knife, perfect for maiming turnips and little else. As your teeth wrestle a chunk of gristle, you hear a thud behind you. Someone's trencher has split down the middle, unleashing a cascade of broth onto their lap. You decide not to laugh, if only because your trencher now sports a suspicious fissure down the side. You shift your elbows to redistribute weight. That's your evening now. Structural integrity management. Then comes the bread, or what they call bread. Dark, dense, and so dry it seems to absorb light. You gnaw on a crust and wonder if this is what biting into a bookshelf feels like. Still, it's better than the crusty soup incident the jester keeps reenacting from last week's banquet, where someone mistook the decorative loaf for a chamber pot. I assume the jester was exaggerating, but with these people, it's never clear. The musicians strike up something vaguely cheerful involving bagpipes and a hurdy-gurdy. The sound resembles a cat being turned inside out while yodeling, but the crowd seems delighted. You pretend to sip your cider, which tastes faintly of apple and more strongly of damp boots. Somewhere near the fireplace, a piglet squeals. Someone's pet or tomorrow's entree? Unclear. A servant chases it, skidding across the flagstones with a scream muffled by laughter. Historians still argue whether these feasts were primarily for eating or impressing. Likely both. Some suggest the actual taste of the food mattered less than the grandeur of its presentation. Given the state of your trencher, that tracks. You lean back as a server tips a bit more broth onto what remains of your pottage. You murmur thanks, wondering if your sleeve will ever be dry again. Probably not. There's a clatter from the kitchen, something involving iron pots and a chef yelling about a missing goose. I hope it's a metaphor. You look around. The walls shimmer with torchlight, and you're aware, for a moment, of the centuries pressing in around you. The smells, the steam, the crumbs collecting in your lap, this is history as lived through the stomach. You shift in your seat. There's more to come, and judging by the scent wafting from the back, it involves fish, possibly eels, definitely regret.
The scent hits you before the eel does. You're still adjusting your soggy sleeve when a pair of kitchen boys barrel through the hall doors carrying a wooden tub the size of a rain barrel. Inside, eels. Live. Slippery. Wriggling. A bubbling black mass of serpentine chaos. One tries to leap for freedom and lands with a soft splat on the flagstone. Nobody seems surprised. You blink slowly as a steward claps twice, signaling the grand reveal of the next course. Eels in wine and ginger. Or so he claims. From your seat, it looks more like a dare than a dish. A line of cooks begins hauling the eels toward the fire pit, where a great iron pot waits, already steaming. The eels hiss as they go. One flips dramatically midair, slaps a cook in the face, and earns a cheer from the nearby minstrels. You make a mental note. Never trust an animal that keeps moving after seasoning. The guests shift in their seats. A nobleman with a beard that could store a week's grain is already licking his lips, tapping his trencher expectantly. Across the room, the jester mimics the eel's death spiral. He's rewarded with a ladle full of broth to the head. You return your attention to your own plate, or rather the spot where your first course has mostly soaked into the bread. A new trencher is plunked down. Fresh-ish. You eye it like a replacement parachute stitched by a drunk monk. Soon, the eel stew arrives, ladled out into your soggy bread bowl. The liquid is brown, flecked with herbs, and disturbingly glossy. Floating just beneath the surface is a pale, curved segment of eel, skin still intact, looking very much like a polite question mark. You take a cautious bite. It's surprisingly flavorful. The ginger gives it bite, the wine makes it warm, and the eel has a buttery texture, if you don't think about it too hard. You chew slowly, as if by doing so you might outrun regret. A few nobles seem less enchanted. One pokes at his eel with a jeweled dagger. Another discreetly drops his into a passing hound's mouth. The dog swallows it whole and immediately lies down, groaning softly like a knight after a bad duel. Historians still argue whether eel was considered a delicacy out of genuine taste or simply a show of wealth and access. After all, only the well-connected could summon a tub of freshwater noodles on autopilot at a moment's notice. But the sheer frequency of its appearance on feast records suggests people kept eating it, or kept pretending to. As you try not to make eye contact with the eel's tiny jaw still intact on one curl, you notice something far more alarming. A puddle forming beneath your trencher. The heat of the stew has compromised its structural loyalty. Slowly, deliberately, you reach for a cloth napkin, starched to the consistency of parchment, and wedge it under the bread. It absorbs nothing, it just crumbles. The servants are now circulating with fresh pitchers of wine. It's dark, potent stuff, closer to vinegar than vintage. But you're grateful for anything that resets your mouth from pond back to person. You take a sip. Your eyebrows leap involuntarily. To distract yourself, you watch a boy with a feathered cap attempt to carve a smiley face into his eel with a spoon. He fails. The eel slides away, hits the edge of the table, and flops into a lady's lap. Her scream is sharp and brief. She glares, then laughs. This, apparently, is the medieval version of a social icebreaker. Next to you, a monk is explaining the spiritual symbolism of eel, something about flexibility in the soul or sin slipping through fingers. You nod politely, chewing a mouthful of something that might be sage or might be gravel. Hard to say. The texture is confident. You wonder if anyone's keeping track of how many eels are left. They seem infinite. There's now an eel folded over the edge of the silver plate at the high table, like a very damp ribbon. A servant, wild-eyed and flushed, bursts in from the kitchen yelling, "They got into the almond paste." You never find out who they are, but the almond tart is quickly whisked off the menu. You focused on finishing your portion before your trencher gives up completely. A single eel eye stares back at you. You cover it with a sprig of parsley. The musicians launch into something new, an up-tempo jig involving a shaw, a crumb horn, and what you can only assume is a goatskin bag being stomped on rhythmically. Guests begin to sway with the beat, hands sloshing wine, elbows knocking platters. One man near the hearth accidentally sets his sleeve on fire. He puts it out with a goblet of stew. The eel survives. A servant passes with a platter of candied eel skins, which seem to be strips of leather with the faint aroma of molasses. You wave them away. Your trencher finally collapses. It was time. You let the contents spill onto your pewter spoon, wipe your hands on your cloak, and sigh. That was only the second course. There are at least 8 more to go, and rumors of a swan being sewn into a boar being sewn into a horse. That might be tomorrow or dessert. You sit back, belly warming slightly, eyes drawn to the torches flickering along the wall. Eel, it turns out, may not be delicious, but it is oddly hypnotic in quantity. And the next dish is already sizzling its way across the room.
The marchpane is melting. Not a metaphor, though it could be. No, the grand centerpiece of tonight's feast, a towering sculpture of marchpane shaped like a miniature cathedral, is beginning to slump visibly. Its spires lean like tired monks, its sugar-glass windows dripping under the heat of nearby torches. One by one, the almond flour buttresses give way, and the whole thing sighs into itself like a ruined dream. You stare at it from a safe distance. At least it still smells pleasant, sweet, nutty, and vaguely floral, like something meant to be a gift, and not, as it turns out, a slow-motion collapse of prestige. Guests around you gasp politely, some fanning themselves with linen napkins. A boy with curls tries to catch a melting gargoyle in his hands before it hits the floor. He fails. It lands with a soft splat and a puff of powdered sugar. A servant hurries forward with a silver platter and attempts to salvage the top half. The steward overseeing the meal looks horrified, not because the cathedral is dying, but because he now has to explain to the lord of the manor that the marzipan angels have face-planted. You shift slightly, watching as slices of what was once sacred architecture are now discreetly served on pewter saucers. You receive a hunk of archway. It's warm, too warm. You press your fingers into it and feel it pulse gently, like a loaf in distress. You take a bite. It's chewy, cloying, and very, very almondy. Historians still argue whether marchpane was ever supposed to taste good, or if it was always more performance than pleasure. It was, after all, expensive. Sugar and almonds weren't commoner fare. They belonged to royalty, bishops, and occasionally apothecaries who had questionable taste in both food and potions. Your piece of cathedral now has a visible thumbprint where you pressed too hard. You discreetly flip it over. Nobody notices. A musician strikes a chord. Not a good one. His lute sounds as if it's strung with cheese twine, but he carries on bravely. The background noise of chatter and scraping trencher crumbs drowns him out. The marchpane had been sculpted, you recall, to resemble the nearby abbey of St. Daffodil, a building known more for its drafty cloisters than any architectural merit. Apparently, the cook had taken liberties, adding minarets, a moat, and what appeared to be a pastry dragon curled around the nave. The dragon remains intact, but its head now slumps over its sugared tail. Across the table, someone makes a joke about how the cathedral looks better now. You laugh too hard. Possibly the wine. Possibly hysteria. There's a gentle thump as the last of the marchpane roof gives way. A priest murmurs something that sounds like a blessing, or a sigh. You take another bite. The sugar hits you with the force of a mild accusation. The steward appears again, wiping sweat from his brow with a sleeve that's already soaked. He announces, without irony, that the next course will be swan with spices, robed in its own feathers. You glance at your marchpane. It looks almost relieved to be done. Moments later, the swan arrives, or more accurately, is wheeled in on a large silver platter, upright, proud, beady eyes wide open in eternal shock. Its feathers have been stitched back onto its cooked body, like a child's craft project gone very wrong. The scent of cinnamon, clove, and overcompensation follows it like a cloud. The swan is beautiful in the way that things become beautiful when you know they cost too much to be ugly. Its neck is arched unnaturally. Its beak has been painted gold. A single feather floats off into the air as the platter jolts to a halt. The cook bows. The guests clap. The jester attempts to imitate the swan's death pose and knocks over a wine jug. Nobody minds. You're served a slice of breast meat, delicately shaved and placed beside a pile of currants and crushed black pepper. The feather, mercifully, has been removed from your portion. You chew slowly. It's gamey, lean, dry. The kind of meat that reminds you swans were not made for eating, more like enduring. There's an undertone of wet reeds. You take another bite just to confirm. Yes, definitely reeds. You look around. Others are doing the same polite chew-nod combo. The lord of the manor beams with pride. He assumes the applause is for him. It might be, or it might just be relief that the swan didn't explode. Historians still argue whether swan was ever truly desirable or just an edible display of status. After all, nothing says, "I'm important," like spending a day skinning and then redressing an angry waterfowl. You finish your portion, washing it down with something labeled as honeyed ale, but tasting like ale that once sat near a honeycomb and overheard it in passing. Still, it soothes the sugar-flecked back of your throat. The ruined marchpane cathedral is now a pile of sticky relics. One guest is licking a parapet. Another has tried to balance a piece of the nave on her head. She's surprisingly steady. The musicians pick up speed again. A lute, a rebec, and a drum the size of a wine barrel set a rhythm that encourages both digestion and mild regret. You lean back, hands folded over your belly, and breathe. The marchpane may have fallen, the swan may have swum its last, but somehow you're still standing, still chewing, still very, very full. And from the clatter behind the curtain, it sounds like the next course involves a sauce that has just betrayed its pot.
You hear it before you see it, the unmistakable clack of a ladle hitting the floor, followed by an explosive sneeze echoing from the kitchen, then another, and another. Something's gone terribly wrong with the sauce. Moments later, the pot appears. Carried by two red-faced servants, it's nearly bubbling over, releasing thick coils of peppery steam into the banquet hall. A third servant trails behind with a tray of roasted meats, presumably meant to be drowned in this aromatic mystery. You instinctively lean back, eyes watering before the sauce even gets near. The steward, still sweating from the swan debacle, clears his throat and announces the arrival of wild duck with spiced pepper sauce. It sounds simple, but judging from the way diners on the left side of the hall are now coughing into their napkins, you sense simplicity is not on tonight's menu. The sauce is ladled generously over each portion. Yours arrives steaming, a dark and viscous pool glistening menacingly beside a rather deflated duck leg. The bird looks confused. You feel the same. You cut into it, and steam whooshes upward like a genie escaping a very spicy lamp. One sniff, and your sinuses surrender. Your eyes water. You sneeze into your cloak and mutter an apology to no one. Historians still argue whether medieval cooks intentionally made sauces this strong to disguise questionable meat or to test the bravery of their guests. Either theory feels plausible as you take your first bite. It burns. Not a fire, exactly, more like a creeping warmth that begins at the back of your throat and spreads like gossip. The pepper floods your senses. You take a hasty gulp of ale, which only adds a strange bitterness to the mix. A noblewoman across from you fumbles blindly for her goblet, while her husband dabs his forehead with a turkey leg. One bold child declares it tangy before promptly hiccuping and falling off his stool. The duck itself is fine. Dry but well cooked, beneath the blanket of war crimes masquerading as sauce. The skin is crisp, though the meat feels like it's trying to escape its seasoning. You focus on small bites and large gulps. Around the room, you see varied strategies. Some swirl their duck in the sauce like it's molten gold, others scrape it off and hide it beneath their bread trenchers. One guest dramatically offers his share to a passing dog, who sniffs it once and backs away, offended. Meanwhile, a musician tries to improvise a song about the spicy duck of fate. He's pelted with breadcrumbs. The steward looks visibly distressed. It's unclear whether it's the sauce or the fact that the tapestry near the hearth has caught an ember. A servant douses it with a flagon of cider. Everyone cheers. You blow gently on your next bite, but it's no use. The pepper has become airborne. The very air now tastes like fire and regret. And yet, there's something oddly invigorating about it, like you've been slapped awake by a condiment. Next to you, a monk tries to identify every spice in the sauce. You hear him murmur, black pepper, clove, a hint of mustard seed, possibly dried horseradish root. Then he sneezes so hard, he drops his spoon into his goblet. You find yourself sweating, but not unpleasantly. It's the kind of warmth that makes your ears ring but your limbs relax. A curious contradiction. Pain paired with euphoria, discomfort marinated in delight. Or perhaps it's just the ale kicking in. The jester, seizing the opportunity, begins pretending to duel an invisible pepper demon. He loses dramatically, collapsing into a pile of straw and wine-soaked bread. Someone starts a slow clap. At the high table, the lord of the manor grins proudly, declaring, "A sauce fit for kings and dragons alike." His mistress discreetly sips milk behind a veil. You try to slow your pace. There's more food to come, so much more. But the duck, for all its challenges, has given you a kind of second wind. You sit straighter, your nose runs. You don't care. Across the hall, a servant slips on spilled sauce and goes sliding like a medieval curling stone. He lands near the fire, grinning sheepishly. The guests applaud again. Tonight, it seems, everything is entertainment. You take a final bite, this time deliberately dragging the meat through every last streak of sauce. Why not? Your taste buds are already at war, a little more can't hurt. The flavor explodes again, and for a brief moment, you feel weightless, transported. Not to a place of culinary excellence, but to one of shared human absurdity. You imagine the cook back in the kitchen, probably wiping his brow and mumbling, "Next time, less pepper," while a nearby apprentice fans the sauce pot like it's a holy relic. You push your trencher away, now more soup than plate, and breathe out through your mouth, fanning yourself with a napkin that smells faintly of duck and regret. The sauce was terrible. The sauce was brilliant. The sauce was unforgettable. and judging by the sudden sound of flapping wings and a loud thunk from the next course's arrival, it's about to be upstaged.
You hear feathers before you see them. A strange rustling begins at the far end of the hall, followed by gasps and shrieks that ping-pong between amusement and alarm. Then, right on cue, someone yells, "The pie is alive!" And indeed, it is. Two servants march solemnly toward the high table, carrying what can only be described as a structural risk. An enormous pie, at least 3 feet across, puffed high and gilded to a bronze sheen. The crust is scored with elaborate designs, stars, roses, and what might be a very confused lion. On top rests a garland of herbs and something resembling a tiara? You squint. It might actually be a tiara. The jester announces it in song, "A wonder pie, a prince inside, or birds or frogs or something that flied." He's nearly trampled as the pie is placed with great ceremony at the center of the table. Everyone leans in. The servant lifts the crust. And chaos explodes. 4 tiny birds, finches maybe, or frantic sparrows, burst into the air like a magic trick gone slightly wrong. One crashes into a sconce, another dive-bombs a goblet, and a third lands squarely in the stew of a noblewoman, who lets out a squeal that registers somewhere between opera and insult. The 4th bird circles above your head twice, flutters, then lands daintily on your shoulder. You freeze. It stares at you. You stare back. It chirps once, then departs toward the rafters, leaving behind a single feather and an oddly touching sense of camaraderie. Historians still argue whether these live bird pies were common or simply mythical exaggerations. Some suggest they were a form of edible pageantry, while others insist they were practical jokes by cooks with too much wine and not enough supervision. Either way, tonight, you are a witness. The remains of the pie are dished out. Beneath the birds, there is food. Kind of. Mostly minced meat and something that might be apple or pear. Possibly both. The spices are strong, cinnamon, clove, and maybe a hint of whatever was used to sedate the birds, unsuccessfully, it seems. You take a bite. It's oddly sweet. The crust is flakier than expected, which is both pleasant and a logistical hazard, as crumbs now coat your lap like buttery confetti. The filling is dense, vaguely meaty, and there's a crunch. You pause. Was that bone? Or a clove? You choose not to investigate. A second bite confirms nothing, except that the pie is at least warmer than the room. The bird that landed in the noblewoman's stew is now perched on a candlestick, preening smugly. The noblewoman has refused a replacement dish, and instead adopted the bird, naming it Pudding. No one questions it. A page boy brings another ladle of sauce. You instinctively shield your trencher. He nods, understanding. The jester, emboldened by the success of his bird rhyme, attempts to recite a limerick about crust. He's rewarded with polite claps and a slice of pie that he promptly hides under his hat for later. The hall smells now of pastry and singed feathers, mingling in a way that suggests both comfort and danger. You sip more ale. It no longer tastes sharp. It tastes inevitable. You reflect briefly on the mechanics of the pie. How did they keep the birds alive in there? Were they tucked in post-bake through a hidden flap? Were they bribed with breadcrumbs? You have questions. No one has answers. One of the cooks enters, beaming, holding up a second, smaller pie. "This one's got frogs," he announces. You don't know whether he's serious. You look around. The Marchpane Cathedral is now rubble. The swan carcass lies forgotten, feathers drooping in shame. The duck sauce still smolders faintly in some corners. And now, birds. You half expect the next course to involve interpretive dance from a pig. But here's the strange thing. It's all oddly charming. Despite the disasters, the messes, the mingling aromas and mild wildlife invasion, the room is glowing. Literally from the torchlight, but also from the wine, the laughter, the shared absurdity of a meal no one can possibly forget. A guest near the fire stands and delivers a toast to pie, to pigeons, and to peril. The hall erupts in applause. Your slice of pie now resembles something trampled by a mule. You eat it anyway. The musicians strike up another tune, this time something cheerful and lilting. A few guests begin to sway. Some rise and attempt to dance. A child places a bird feather in her hair like a crown. The jester pirouettes. You catch the eye of the steward, who gives a weary but satisfied nod. The pie didn't kill anyone, the birds haven't stolen any rings, and the guests are still upright. That, in medieval banquet standards, is a roaring success. You lean back, full, feathered, and bemused. And then, someone asks, "Where's the boar's head?" The room goes still. A deep, triumphant grunt echoes from the corridor. The next course is ready.
You turn your head just in time to witness it. The boar's head. It's massive. Two sweating footmen wheel it in on a low cart draped with velvet. The head rests on a platter the size of a door, flanked by roast apples, garlands of rosemary, and what may or may not be strategically placed pine cones. Its eyes, glazed over and gleaming, stare straight ahead, teeth bared in a frozen snarl. Between those tusks, a lemon is crammed like a pacifier offered far too late. The boar's head is not alone. Behind it, like a bizarre funeral procession, marches a parade of roasted parts, hams, haunches, ribs, sausages twisted into elaborate knots. There's even something shaped like a crown, made entirely from pig trotters. You're not sure whether to applaud or seek absolution. The steward announces the course with an exaggerated flourish. "The crowned beast of the forest." The musicians respond with a dramatic fanfare that ends with the unmistakable sound of a tuba made from a cow horn. You brace yourself. The head is lifted, carefully, reverently, onto the high table. There is a ceremonial carving knife, etched with Latin phrases and grease fingerprints. The carver, a man with arms like cured hams, steps forward and bows. Then, with the precision of a surgeon and the flair of a street juggler, he slices into the boar. Steam hisses from the meat like a sigh of release. The scent follows, intense, earthy, wild, a cocktail of smoke, sage, garlic, and wood ash. You can almost taste the forest floor. Your slice arrives shortly after. It's thick, dark, threaded with fat, and glistening in the flickering torchlight. There's crackling on the side, glorious, golden crackling, crisp enough to break a tooth or a marriage vow. You take a bite, and for a moment all the madness fades. The meat is tender, deeply flavored, smoky and rich, without being overpowering. It tastes of ceremony, of slow cooking over open fire, of hours tended by hands that know hunger and hospitality in equal measure. The crackling shatters between your teeth like stained glass made of salt and glory. This is good. Historians still argue whether boar's head was more about flavor or fear. It was a beast of legend, fierce, hard to hunt, a symbol of status and masculinity, served to remind everyone who had the power to dominate nature, or at least outlast it over a fire pit. As you chew, a line from a medieval carol drifts into your mind. Caput apri de ferro rendens laudes Domino. Behold the boar's head, offering praises to the Lord. Or in your case, to your taste buds. Next to you, someone lets out a low moan of pleasure. Across the table, a knight with sauce on his chin raises his goblet and declares, "This, my friends, is why we invented feasts." Someone claps. Someone else burps in agreement. The jester makes a brave attempt at mimicking a wild boar, snorting and lunging through the aisles. He is tackled by a monk who may or may not be entirely sober. You carve another slice. The crackling holds up.
The meat doesn't need more sauce, though a small pot is offered, a reduction of apples and mustard seeds. You dab experimentally. It sings, sweet, sharp, spicy, an alchemy of kitchen and field. For a brief stretch of minutes, the hall is quiet. Not from boredom, but reverence. The only sounds are the scrape of knives, the crack of crackling, the occasional sigh of joy. Even the birds have quieted. Pudding is asleep on a candlestick. Then someone begins a chant. It starts as a hum, low and deep. Others join. It's a wordless song, the kind born from full bellies and just enough wine. A chorus of satisfaction. The kind of moment where language gives way to shared breath and candlelight. You close your eyes briefly. Inhale roasted rosemary and smoke. Exhale contentment. It doesn't last, of course. These things never do. The next cart rolls in. On it, an entire salmon, dyed pink with saffron, crowned with shrimp, and riding a bed of violet petals. The chant dies. You lift your goblet, finish the last of your ale, and prepare yourself. The boar's head, now picked over and hollow-eyed, grins across the table like a satisfied ghost. You nod to it. You understand. For now, the beast has been conquered.
The salmon is staring at you. Its glassy eyes, gently lacquered with honey and saffron glaze, fixate on your face with what can only be described as fishy indignation. Its mouth is open, mid-complaint perhaps, and its head tilts ever so slightly, as though judging your outfit. The body, in contrast, is resplendent. It's been dyed pink, artfully arranged in waves like a reclining noblewoman. Around it, shrimp stand like soldiers, their shells gleaming under a dusting of rose petals. Scattered violets and shredded mint complete the spectacle. You'd think it a dish for a queen if it didn't also smell vaguely like a harbor at low tide. A herald attempts to announce it as the salmon of virtuous victory, but trips over his words and accidentally says viscous victory, which, frankly, seems more accurate. You receive your portion, a neat rectangle of salmon, unnervingly symmetrical, topped with a shrimp curled like a punctuation mark. You prod the shrimp gently. It jiggles. You pretend not to notice. You begin with the salmon. It flakes under your fork with the softness of parchment left in the sunbeam. You lift a bite to your mouth and pause as a waft of something floral hits you. Mint? Lavender? There's no time to debate. You bite. It's confusing. The fish is perfectly cooked, tender and moist, but the flavors have been caught in a medieval tug-of-war. Sweet honey glaze meets the perfumed chaos of edible flowers. Somewhere, mustard seed makes a desperate grab for your palate. A single violet petal clings to your lip like a hopeful admirer. You glance around. Others are reacting similarly, heads tilted, brows furrowed, chewing slowly as if waiting for the dish to introduce itself properly. A knight whispers to his companion, "Is it dessert?" The companion nods, uncertain. The shrimp is tougher, both in texture and emotional presence. You chew it cautiously. It tastes of seawater and saffron and, perhaps, ambition. It's trying so hard to be important. You want to pat it on the back and say, "You're doing fine." Historians still argue whether such elaborate seafood presentations were common or reserved for the most opulent occasions. Transporting fresh fish inland was a logistical challenge, requiring ice, magic, or a very fast horse. To see it arrive in such form, dyed, decorated, and daringly perfumed, was to know your host had both power and a whimsical cook. You sip water, hoping to recalibrate your tongue. It doesn't help. The water now tastes faintly of violets, too. Across the table, someone sneezes into a rosebud. A woman fans herself with a shrimp tail. Her neighbor dips his into mustard and eats it.
No one reacts. The jester returns, this time wearing a salmon-skin sash, declaring himself Lord of the briny court. He bows deeply. The sash tears. He does not recover with dignity. You refocus on your plate. The next bite is better. You adjust to the sweetness, lean into the oddity, surrender to the lavender and lemon balm swirl. It's not a meal. It's a mood. One that smells like soap and stings like sea spray. You can't decide if you like it, but you do respect it. And there's something oddly comforting about a dish that makes no effort to be normal. The salmon was never here to please you. It was here to challenge you, to test your resolve, to remind you that, yes, feasts could be beautiful and bewildering in equal measure. The servant refills your goblet with something pale and sparkling. Cider? Mead? Fermented pear tears. You don't ask. You sip. It's crisp, clean, almost too modern, but welcome. One guest asks the steward if the fish was local. The steward says only, "We borrowed it from the bishop." No one knows what that means. Everyone nods anyway. You watch the head of the salmon slowly tilt as the melting glaze shifts. It now appears to be laughing. You raise your glass to it. Well played, fish. The musicians strike up a lilting air involving a harp, a bell, and what sounds suspiciously like someone whistling through a turkey bone. It's oddly soothing. You exhale. Let the petals fall where they may. As the servers begin clearing the floral battlefield, you push away your plate and lean back, stretching your arms slightly. Your breath carries a hint of dill and defiance. The next course, you've heard, involves meatballs. But not just any meatballs. Meatballs sculpted into animals. You sit up straighter. Dinner, it seems, is about to get weird again.
The meatballs arrive with a level of fanfare usually reserved for coronations or plagues. A hush falls over the hall as a series of platters are paraded in, each bearing what could only be described as culinary puppetry, meatballs sculpted into the shapes of forest animals, foxes, deer, badgers, and even one alarmingly accurate hedgehog, complete with clove-spiked eyes and tiny almond teeth. You blink. You were expecting balls of meat, not taxidermied dinner. The steward steps forward with barely concealed pride and proclaims, "Behold, the wild hunt!" The jester howls in agreement, crawling on all fours and snarling at the boar's head remains. Someone throws him a bread roll. Each guest is served their own beast. Yours is a squirrel, mid-leap, its tiny paws delicately carved from sausage and its tail fluffed with browned breadcrumbs. The level of detail is unsettling. You poke it gently with your fork and half expect it to scurry off your plate. Historians still argue whether medieval meatball artistry was a regular feature of elite feasts or the result of one particularly ambitious cook with a fondness for woodland creatures and too much free time. You suspect the latter. No sane person should be this good at shaping venison into squirrels. The scent is hearty, onions, mace, and sage, with a hint of nutmeg. You take a cautious bite from the squirrel's hindquarters. The meatball itself is tender and richly spiced, its gamey flavor mellowed by breadcrumbs and fat. It's delicious, worryingly so. You begin to feel bad for mocking its face. Across the table, a nobleman devours a meatball badger with such gusto that its almond nose flies into someone's goblet. A gasp, a pause, then laughter. It's that kind of night. You dissect your squirrel carefully, trying to preserve its dignity. Others are less considerate. A boy bites off the head of a meatball owl and declares himself Lord of the Nocturnal Snack. His mother does not correct him. There's a frog made entirely from pork, a rabbit made of veal. Someone claims to have found a lark, though it may just be a misshapen meatball with delusions of grandeur.
The jester returns, holding two meatball stoats like marionettes. He puts on a brief play about the stoats of courtly scandal, complete with squeaky voices and tragic endings. It gets a standing ovation and 3 thrown olives. You sip your mead, half sweet and half fermented confusion. It pairs oddly well with the squirrel. You take another bite. The tail is the best part, crunchy, herby, slightly crisped from the fire. It tastes of rosemary and rebellion. You chew slowly, savoring the weirdness. You hear someone ask, "Is it wrong that I feel guilty?" The response is a shrug and a bite of fox leg. The meats are surprisingly varied. Some taste of lamb, others of pork blended with dried figs and black pepper. There's a faint sweetness in some bites, possibly currants. You suspect at least one of the animals contains more breadcrumbs than actual meat, but it works. This is not food, it's storytelling, with teeth. The kitchen doors swing open again. This time the servers carry smaller platters, each bearing tiny hedges fashioned from parsley and breadsticks. Within them, little meatball mice peek out, black peppercorn eyes and string cheese tails. The howl erupts. Guests coo. One woman refuses to eat hers and instead names it Bertrand. Bertrand is wrapped in a napkin and placed gently in her lap. You're served 2 mice. You eat the first. It squeaks, metaphorically. You spare the second, tucking it beside a crust of bread and whispering, "Live well, little one." The flavors blend now, meat and herbs, spices and spectacle. Your senses are overwhelmed, but in the best way. This isn't just dinner, it's theater. Every bite tells a story, even if the moral is, don't sculpt squirrels from venison. You lean back. The platters are being cleared, guests wiping their fingers on embroidered napkins. Laughter bubbles through the room like a spilled tankard. Even the salmon seems to smirk from its floral grave. The steward steps forward once more. He raises a hand. Silence descends. "In honor of Saint Hubert, patron of hunters and meatballs," he declares solemnly, "we now proceed to the pudding course." You hear a distant gong. Someone whispers, "May God help us all." The pudding arrives on fire. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally, gloriously, undeniably on fire. A procession of wide-eyed servants carries it in, each holding a torch aloft, while a single central platter holds what resembles a cannonball wrapped in pastry and bathed in brandy. Flames lick upward in eerie blue wisps, casting flickering shadows on the walls and drawing hushed gasps from the banquet hall. This is not the end of the meal, it's the climax. You lean back slightly, just in case. The steward proclaims it the flaming fig and marrow pudding, crowned with suet stars and candied walnuts. You stop chewing your squirrel tail mid-bite and stare. Did he just say marrow? The flaming dessert is placed at the head of the high table. As the fire subsides, the carver steps forward and slices into the dome. A wave of scent bursts forth, dried fruit, treacle, brandy, cloves, and something undeniably meaty. You receive your portion. It jiggles. Beneath a golden brown crust lies a dense core of chopped figs, dates, nuts, bits of bread soaked in syrup, and the unmistakable shimmer of bone marrow. It glistens like jelly and smells like Christmas crossed with a butcher shop. Historians still argue whether sweet and savory puddings were born of frugality, innovation, or utter chaos. Some claim marrow was prized for its richness and health properties. Others believe it was simply there because someone dared to say, "What if dessert, but with bones?" You take a small, strategic bite and immediately regret your cowardice. It's delicious. The sweetness of the figs is deep and lush, soaked in wine and molasses, and the marrow adds an absurdly silky mouthfeel, like butter that's been taught poetry. The suet stars on top crumble like sweet snowflakes, and the candied walnuts crunch just enough to keep things grounded. Around you, reactions vary wildly. One guest moans with delight. Another quietly slides their portion under the table, hoping the dog will handle it. It will not. A bishop tries to claim it violates Lent. No one listens. You venture a second bite. It's even better, warmer, richer, more complex. The kind of flavor that makes your eyes flutter closed and your jaw go slack. You feel like you've eaten part of a stained glass window. The jester makes a pun about figuratively dying of joy. He is pelted with candied walnut shards. Meanwhile, a noblewoman dabs brandy on her neck and declares it the finest perfume she's worn all season. You finish the pudding. You are full. Gloriously, devastatingly full. But the feast, like history, cares little for your comfort. The next course is not food. It's a play. Servants wheel in a makeshift stage, planks laid over barrels draped in red fabric. A troupe of masked performers begins a farce titled The Cook, the Quail, and the Improper Pomegranate. It involves mistaken identities, a dancing turnip, and at least 3 pastry-based puns. The crowd loves it. You chuckle mid-chew as a pie explodes on stage, flinging berry-stained linen into the crowd. A knight catches a piece and yells, "Encore!" while licking his fingers. You settle into the lull that follows a truly absurd dessert, your mind foggy with sugar, your limbs slightly leaden. You sip from a mug of warm spiced milk. It tastes like bedtime and cinnamon. And just when you think it's over, surely, this must be the end, a bell rings. "Digestive course!" someone yells. You groan. But you're also curious. The hall fills with the scent of herbs, fennel, mint, caraway, and something smoky. Small bowls are placed before each guest, little cubes of quince jelly, slivers of candied ginger, and, because this is still medieval England, a dish of caraway-dusted fried eel skins. You blink. Of course. The eel skins crunch pleasantly. The quince is sharp and floral, and the ginger resets your soul. These aren't just foods, they're apologies. The cooks are gently ushering you toward the end, massaging your stomach, whispering, "You've survived. You did well."
When you open your eyes again, the hall has dimmed. Not gone dark, just softened. Candles are now half-height, flickering lazily. The torches burn lower, casting long, painterly shadows across tablecloths littered with breadcrumbs, feathers, and the occasional abandoned almond hoof. The jester is asleep in a barrel. The dog, still ignoring the marrow pudding under the table, has curled up beside a dropped shoe. And you are still seated, somewhere between dream and digestion. The steward reappears, moving more slowly now as though weighed down by the evening's absurdities. He clinks his knife against a goblet, not yours, thankfully, and clears his throat. "We close this night," he says, "with a toast to forgetfulness." A murmur runs through the crowd, not confusion, understanding. It's been a banquet of strange pleasures, excesses, and minor acts of edible warfare. Forgetfulness feels like the only dignified way forward. The final drink is poured. Small pewter goblets are set before each guest, filled with a pale, cloudy liquid that smells faintly of apples and something smoky, wood, perhaps, or regret. It's called sleepy cider, a blend brewed with calming herbs, chamomile, hops, valerian root, and a splash of whatever made the jester start rhyming in Latin earlier. You sip it. It tastes like a lullaby wrapped in wool.
Historians still argue whether medieval nightcaps were genuinely medicinal or merely a polite excuse to pass out. Likely both. You take another sip. Your shoulders loosen. The knot behind your eye, formed during the live bird pie incident, begins to dissolve. The steward nods, satisfied. His job is nearly done. The feast has played every card: meat and fruit, fish and fire, absurdity and artistry. The only thing left is stillness. A hush settles again. Then, as if summoned by the cider, a final procession begins, not of food, but of people. Servants collect plates and trays, musicians switch to harp and flute, a soft voice begins a lullaby in a language older than the bread, and the lights dim even more. You look around the hall, guests lean on elbows, heads resting on shoulders, goblets held loosely in laps. A knight snores into a plum tart, a duchess wraps a napkin around her neck like a scarf and mutters something about beets. The steward approaches your side of the table, quietly now. He sets down a small square of honeycomb on a porcelain plate, dusted with crushed lavender and a single silver sugar pearl. You don't ask. You simply eat it. It is the last taste of the night. Delicate, silent, sticky, sweet. The honey melts on your tongue, the lavender lingers on your breath. You close your eyes. You remember the burning sauce, the dancing meatballs, and the mouse named Bertrand. You remember the feeling of being overwhelmed, amused, disoriented, and delighted, all in a single, unbroken sitting. And then, silence. The hall grows still. The candles are snuffed, one by one. You feel your fingers go slack, your limbs soften, your thoughts drift. The last thing you hear is the steward's voice, low and soft, whispering, "You may forget the flavors, but you'll never forget the feast." And you believe him.
Morning arrives with a limp. You don't so much wake as slowly reassemble. An aching jaw here, a crust of honey there, and a vague memory of talking to a squirrel. Not a real one, of course. A meatball. Possibly sentient. The hall is quieter now. Daylight filters in through narrow windows, casting long golden streaks across the battered tables. Trays are stacked. Goblets are drained. Napkins droop like flags after a lost battle. You rise, or attempt to. Your knees remind you of the seated acrobatics you performed during the pudding course. You stretch, wincing, and glance around. A few guests are still sprawled in varying states of culinary recovery. One woman is curled under a tapestry. The jester is inexplicably wearing a pie tin as a crown. And yet, there is movement. The cooks are back. You hear them before you see them. Clanging pans, muffled laughter, the scrape of knives against cutting boards. Already, preparations begin for the next day's meals, because in medieval England, feasting is less an event and more a recurring threat. You wander, half-dazed, toward the kitchen. There, amid clouds of flour and the steady rhythm of rolling pins, you witness a strange sight. Leftovers, but not sad scraps tossed aside. These are being transformed, repurposed, reinvented, made strange again. Yesterday's boar becomes today's pottage. Bits of salmon find their way into herb pies. The pudding? Sliced and fried in suet for something disturbingly called breakfast crisp. A boy stands over a bubbling cauldron, tossing in torn chunks of bread and whispering spells. Well, recipes, but they sound like magic. The cook overseeing him nods solemnly. "Always honor the feast," she says. even in its aftermath. You are handed a bowl. It's hot, humble, and smells of garlic, ale, and leftover glory. You sip. It warms your ribs. Historians still argue whether medieval kitchens respected leftovers or buried them in haste. Archaeological evidence suggests a bit of both. Some scraps were saved with reverence. Others fed to pigs or people, depending on mood and supply. In your bowl, however, is a moment of redemption. You sit by the fire, cupping the bowl in both hands. Around you, cooks hum softly, prepping, peeling, plotting. It's less frantic than the night before, but no less sacred. A servant walks by with a tray of eggs dyed pink with beet juice. Another carries what looks like dried apple rings soaked in cider. A third has managed to mold butter into the shape of a crown. You begin to realize something. The feast never ends. It just changes costumes. What was theatrical excess at night becomes cozy ritual by dawn. The ingredients remain, reshuffled, like actors returning to the stage in new roles. Less drama, more sincerity. Someone hands you a slice of bread still warm, slathered in goat's cheese and drizzled with rosemary honey. You don't ask where it came from. You eat it in 3 silent bites and nearly weep. Outside, the village stirs. You glimpse smoke rising from chimneys. Someone is already sweeping the square. A boy leads a donkey with a basket of apples tied to its back. The sky is soft and gray, like a ceiling made of oatmeal. You exhale. This, you think, is the real digestion, the quiet processing of joy and absurdity, of flavor and laughter, of pies with wings and squirrels with breadcrumb tails. Your limbs are looser now, your mind steadier. You feel not just fed, but remembered, as though the meal wasn't just for your body, but for every exhausted, delighted, confused part of you. The steward appears again, holding a list. He smiles. "Tonight's menu," he offers. You pause, then nod. And so it begins again. You don't actually read the steward's list. You just nod and let it linger in your hand like a love letter from a particularly eccentric suitor. It's long, folded multiple times, stained already with something greasy. You unfold it slowly, eyes scanning the ink-blooded script. It begins quite modestly with appetizers: pickled swan tongue, served chilled, buttered turnips with clove dust, saffroned chestnuts, optional. You blink. Swan tongue? The steward, sensing your hesitation, offers a kind smile. They're quite tender, especially when chilled. You don't know whether that's reassuring or terrifying. He continues down the list. We've got eel pastry swirls, like cinnamon rolls, but eelier. Also a commemorative cheese wheel, sculpted with scenes from St. Dymphna's battle with indigestion. You nod solemnly. Naturally. Historians still argue whether such menus were symbolic expressions of power or just a chef's way of fighting boredom. Either way, medieval menus had range, from raw simplicity to full-blown edible stage plays, and often both, served in succession. You follow the steward into a smaller chamber off the main kitchen. It's cooler here, walls lined with shelves stacked high with dried herbs, preserved fruits, and mysterious jars. The cook calls it the quiet pantry. You call it the wizard's cupboard. There's a slab of sugared quince pastes shaped like a falcon, a jar of pickled rosehips labeled "in case of boredom," a covered dish marked "do not taste unless daredevil." You lift the lid. It's boiled celery in vinegar. You put it back down. Nearby, 2 assistants are carefully arranging candied fennel seeds into the shape of a hedgehog. You've seen Stranger Things by now, but you still give them a respectful nod. You sip something, an herbal tisane
with notes of sage and what might be licorice root. It makes your tongue feel like it's been wrapped in velvet and read a poem. You like it. As the steward continues rattling off items for tonight's feast, stuffed heron, garlic glazed frog legs, and a pudding shaped like despair but filled with jam, you begin to feel a peculiar sensation. Anticipation. You're not hungry, not yet, but your curiosity has teeth. Your memory, still soaked in marrow and honey, wants to know what other culinary riddles await. You're shown a basket of eggs dyed with cabbage to a startling shade of blue. Dragon's eggs, the cook explains, for the children and the easily impressed. You fall into both categories. And then you see it. At the far end of the pantry, guarded by 2 jars of mustard and a surprisingly lifelike marzipan mole, is a tall, tiered structure draped in linen. The steward approaches reverently. "This," he says, "is the centerpiece for tonight's display." He whips the cloth off with a flourish. It is a castle. A castle made entirely of bread. Crusty battlements, sourdough towers, rye drawbridges, and a moat made from dark ale jelly. Tiny bannermen, made of licorice and fig, stand on the parapets wielding spears fashioned from almonds. You inhale sharply. It smells like ambition and yeast. No one speaks for a moment. Finally, the steward says, "We'll set it on fire during the 3rd course." You nod. That makes perfect sense. You head back to the hall. Preparations have begun again. Tablecloths replaced, goblets polished, leftover feathers swept under tapestries. The musicians practice a piece involving 2 lutes and a goose call. You find your seat again. Same place, same cushion, slightly more crumbs. You settle in, sighing. Because here, amid the absurdity and aroma, you understand something important. Feasts are not just about food. They are memory machines, art galleries you can eat, nightmares that taste like daydreams, a place where swans lose their tongues and squirrels get shaped out of venison, and somehow it all makes perfect sense. The steward passes by and taps the list in your hand. "You'll want to rest before the hedgehog pie." You smile. Of course you will.
Rest proves elusive. You attempt a nap in one of the side chambers, a quiet cloister with tapestries depicting saints fending off bears, or possibly overly enthusiastic pilgrims. You wrap yourself in a spare curtain, lie flat on a stone bench, and close your eyes. But your brain, traitorous and overfed, replays the feast like a greatest hits album. The flaming pudding, the squirrel, the toast to forgetfulness. You roll onto your side. The stone is not forgiving. Eventually, you give up and wander back toward the main hall. It's quieter still now. Pre-dusk light filters in, that special medieval twilight where everything glows golden except your energy level, which is a distinct shade of beige. A cluster of kitchen boys is chasing each other with ladles. A cook, perched on a stool, is carving tiny violins out of turnips for tonight's decorative salad. You do not ask why. You simply nod and continue on. In a corner of the hall, a low table is being prepared, for children, apparently. You peer over the edge. It's adorable. Tiny trenchers made from hollow bread rolls, spoons shaped like birds, a miniature roast partridge with a flag stuck in it reading Sir Pex-a-lot. You smile despite yourself. A server approaches with a small cup of mulled pear cider. "To settle the nerves," she says. You take it gratefully. It tastes like warm fruit and soft forgiveness. Historians still argue whether medieval children dined with adults or were banished to separate halls for fear of accidental stabbing or questions about pudding. This setup suggests both protection and performance. The The children will feast, yes, but also be watched, marveled at, and gently discouraged from touching anything too flammable. You take a seat again, this time near the window, watching as torchbearers begin lighting sconces along the walls. The room glows slowly to life. The faint clatter of silver, the murmur of anticipation. It's all beginning again. A musician tunes a lute. The steward adjusts a candelabra by half a centimeter and then steps back, admiring the balance as though he's just painted the Sistine Chapel with beeswax. Then, without ceremony, the hedgehog pies arrive. They are exactly what you feared and hoped. The crusts are golden and spiny, each spike crafted from almonds pressed in like tiny spears. Raisin eyes glimmer from the rounded ends, and several of the hedgehogs wear vegetable hats. You think one has a little leek cravat. The cook wheels them in proudly. "Stuffed with pork and dates," he announces, "and lightly scented with rosewater and risk." You're served one directly. It stares at you. You stare back. The crust is buttery and crisp. Your knife crunches through it like breaking into an enchanted artifact. Inside, steam spirals upward, carrying the scent of meat, fruit, and cloves. You take a bite. Oh, it's good. Really good. The pork is rich and sweet, the dates sticky and deep. There's a dash of ginger, a whisper of cinnamon, and enough black pepper to remind you this is still technically dinner, not dessert. You devour your hedgehog with surprising speed. Across the room, someone raises their goblet and shouts, "To edible rodents!" Cheers erupt. It's unclear whether it's irony or sincerity, probably both. The jester emerges again, now wearing a crown of breadsticks and trailing a cape of cabbage leaves. He bows low, announcing himself as the Duke of Digestive Triumph, and promptly falls into a chair. No one helps. It seems expected. A gentle drizzle begins outside, tapping on the tall glassless windows, and in that moment, hedgehog crumbs on your lap and cider warmth in your belly, you feel entirely at peace. The feast may be strange, but you are precisely where you need to be.
Now that your hedgehog has been vanquished, rest in pie, little one, you are convinced that the meal must be nearing its end. It is not. The steward appears again, this time with a look that says, "Brace yourself," and announces, "It is time for the subtlety." The word rings through the air like the toll of a dessert bell. You squint. You remember that word from whispers earlier in the day. Subtleties, they called them. Grand, edible illusions, like edible stagecraft with a sugar budget. Technically dessert, emotionally theater. From behind a velvet curtain, the creation emerges. It is an entire cathedral, made of sugar. Columns of hardened icing, stained glass windows of ruby and citrine, the roof tiled with slivered almonds. Tiny candied saints peer out from gelatin niches, arms lifted in benediction or possibly confusion. At the base is a small plaque made of marzipan that reads, "St. Meringues Abbey." You stare. Someone gasps audibly. The steward beams. It is constructed by hand, using only sugar, patience, and one very small hammer. A monk sneezes somewhere in the background. Even the incense takes pause. Historians still argue whether subtleties were more about religious awe or competitive flexing. Some were political messages cloaked in sugar, others were just because someone could. Tonight's subtlety is a bit of both. It's blessed by a chaplain before being dismantled. A sugar bishop is handed to you reverently, his crozier snapped off like a breadstick. You nibble cautiously. It tastes like vanilla, devotion, and the slow descent into absurdity. Nearby, someone bites into a peppermint buttress. Another licks a stained glass window. You watch a small child pretend to pray before consuming an entire sugar gargoyle. The mood shifts from reverence to ravenous within minutes. The cathedral collapses in stages, its spires crumbling under gentle pressure, its arches reduced to rubble. It is not desecration. It is celebration. The only true act of worship here is digestion. You eat your bishop slowly. He's mostly fondant, a bit too sweet, but you finish him out of respect. Soon, the table is dusted with sugar rubble. Plates pile up with edible debris. The jester appears again, wielding a licorice whip and declaring martial law. No one listens. The musicians begin a slow, whimsical tune, part lullaby, part circus. You sip more cider, or maybe it's clary wine now. It's hard to tell. It tastes faintly of nutmeg and surrender. And just when you think the chaos is over, the steward clears his throat. "One more course," he says, with the calmness of a man who has seen worse. You groan. But also, you nod. Because of course there is. It's a cheese course. But not just any cheese course. A wheel of blue cheese the size of a carriage wheel is rolled in by two grunting kitchen lads. Around it, orbiting like moons, are smaller cheeses, soft, hard, smoked, spiced, marinated in ale or ash or rosewater. Cheeses with names like St. Kevin's Crumble and The Monk's Regret. And accompanying them, preserved pears, honeycombs, crackers shaped like shields, a fig jam labeled "For Those Who Dare." You spread a wedge of something crumbly onto a slice of toasted oat bread. It tastes like salt, smoke, and faint ecclesiastical shame. In other words, perfection. The table falls into a hush, chewing, sighing, the occasional groan of one who has gone too far. You look around. The guests are weary but triumphant. Buttons undone, tunics askew, smiles wide. One man has fallen asleep holding a hunk of goat cheese against his cheek like a beloved pet. And you? You are full, not just in stomach, but in soul. Tonight, you have eaten art, laughed with strangers, consumed a cathedral, and somewhere in the wreckage of sugar saints and hedgehog crusts, you've remembered something vital. History doesn't just live in battles and kings. It lives in pudding.
The hall is quiet again, but not with silence, rather with the sacred hush of collective fullness. It's the hush after the storm, after the jokes have been told and the cheeses licked clean. It's the kind of quiet where everyone is too satisfied to speak, and those who do speak do so in reverent whispers, like they're afraid to wake the pudding ghosts. You sit still, aware of every muscle in your body, each one politely suggesting you never eat again. Then someone says, "Digestive games?" The steward, who has somehow appeared from nowhere yet again, claps his hands. And suddenly, the hall is alive once more. Long tables are cleared. Cushions are tossed into haphazard piles. A burlap sack of carved wooden vegetables is dumped ceremoniously onto the floor. It's time for turnip toss. You're handed a small wooden root and pointed toward a series of hoops hung at uneven intervals along the wall. A servant explains the rules in vague terms involving honor, geometry, and spiritual cleansing. You nod solemnly. You don't understand any of it. Your turn comes. You toss. You miss entirely, the turnip bouncing off a tapestry depicting the martyrdom of Saint Radish. No one laughs. They cheer. You have never been prouder. Historians still argue whether post-feast games were actual traditions or spontaneous expressions of surplus energy and mead. Some records suggest formalized contests, dice games, storytelling duels, even staged mock duels with breadsticks. Others suggest they were pure whim, like eating a custard in the shape of a duck and calling it philosophy. Tonight leans whimsical. Next comes Pin the Tail on the Steward, where a brave steward stands stoically while blindfolded guests attempt to stick scraps of linen on him in what is, charitably, the shape of a donkey. He wins. Then there's a contest simply called the Slow Chase. The rules are never explained. Participants shuffle around the hall in exaggerated slow motion, arms outstretched like ghosts with sore knees. The jester leads. Someone gets stuck under a table. Someone else declares themselves the crawling baron of baked goods and collapses into a heap of napkins. It is, in a word, sublime. You haven't laughed this hard since the flaming pudding. Eventually, the steward raises his hands once more. Now, he says, we rest. No one objects. Cushions are fluffed, benches turned into makeshift beds. Some guests curl up under cloaks, others remain seated, eyes closed, wearing gentle smiles like children after a bedtime story. You find your corner again, the same one from earlier. A small bench, now warmed by your own absence. You sit, stretch, yawn. A servant brings a final offering, a tiny cup of warmed goat's milk, steeped with honey and thyme. You drink it slowly, letting the warmth settle into the gaps between your thoughts. Outside, the drizzle continues, soft, persistent, rhythmic. It taps the window stones like an old friend asking to be remembered. You sigh. Not in regret, not in exhaustion, in awe. This feast, this mad, magical journey of squirrel-shaped meat and sugar cathedrals, wasn't just nourishment, it was history made edible. A reminder that the past wasn't all plague and piety. It was also joy, theater, community, and more cheese than one human should reasonably face in a lifetime. And as you settle deeper into your cushion, you hear one last whisper, possibly from your own sleep-heavy mind. Don't forget the hedgehog. You won't.
Your dreams that night are buttered. You drift through fields of whipped cream clouds and rivers of warm gravy, chased by roast chickens wearing pastry hats. A cheese wheel rolls beside you, whispering sweet nothings about brie and destiny. Somewhere in the distance, a pudding cathedral hums. You awaken to birdsong and a faint ache in your left molar, possibly from excessive fig chewing or the ghost of the hedgehog. The hall is bright now, washed in a soft dawn light that reveals every wine stain, every candied almond, every sleeping nobleman curled around an empty trencher. And in the midst of it all, the cook. She stands like a general surveying a battlefield, hands on hips, a leak in her apron like a badge of honor. Her voice rings out, "Today we cleanse." And so begins the day after. Servants sweep, cooks scrub, even the jester is handed a mop, which he uses as a dance partner for 10 full minutes before being redirected. You are astonishingly not asked to help. Instead, the steward beckons you to a different chamber, a sunlit alcove that smells of citrus and beeswax. A breakfast of light fare awaits. You glance down. There is a plate of cold roasted apples stuffed with oats and wild mint, a honey cake shaped like a small tower, a pot of cream lightly dusted with cinnamon and dignity, a single perfect strawberry glistening like treasure. You take a bite of the cake. It's dense, sweet,
and somehow tastes like the memory of last night filtered through a honeycomb. The steward sits across from you, sipping his own tea. He looks tired. You respect that. Feasts are not just about gluttony, they're about attention. You can't eat a cathedral by accident. You nod slowly, your mouth full of dignified cream. Historians still argue whether breakfasts after medieval banquets were meant to be cleansing or simply comforting. Some records suggest simple porridges and fresh fruit. Others hint at secret morning pies, given only to those who'd earned them by surviving the night without napping in the eel course. You earned this. After the meal, you wander outside. The grounds are misty, damp from the overnight rain. The gardens glisten. Dew clings to cabbage leaves like pearls. A rooster crows half-heartedly, as though hungover. You stroll past the herb beds. Thyme, rosemary, a terrifyingly aggressive patch of sage. You pause to inhale. Herbs and earth and smoke from last night's fires still lingering in the air. Beyond the garden, a group of children runs in circles, flinging flower petals and chanting nonsense about a jam queen. You don't ask. You simply nod as you pass. You sit on a low stone wall. Let the morning seep in. This is digestion, too. Not of food, but of experience. The laughter, the fire, the pudding with sentience. You feel it settle in your bones. And then, a hand on your shoulder. It's the steward. We'll begin preparations again soon, but for now, would you care to help with the pickles? You pause, then smile, because, honestly, why not?
The pickle cellar is colder than you expect. Stone walls, low ceiling, and the faint tang of vinegar woven deep into the air like an ancestral perfume. Jars line the shelves from floor to rafters, packed tight with things that once grew cheerfully in sunlight and are now suspended in eternal brine. The steward hands you a linen apron and a pair of tongs. "Don't trust the onions," he says, utterly deadpan, and disappears into the shadows. You laugh nervously. Then you hear something plop behind a barrel. Maybe it was a mouse. Maybe it was a rebellious gherkin. You proceed anyway. At a table in the center, several jars await attention. Labels in looping medieval script read larkberries, cursed leeks, emergency beets, and something you swear says, "Do not open until Feast of St. Gerald." You choose a safer option, pickled walnuts. Their wrinkled shells float ominously in a dark, spiced syrup the color of melancholy. A cook shows you how to lift them carefully, pat them dry with a cloth, and arrange them on wooden platters like offerings to a very peculiar deity. The process is strangely soothing, meditative even. You fall into a rhythm, lift, pat, place. The brine stings your fingers slightly, a sharp counterpoint to the softness of the morning. "Pickles," the cook says suddenly, "are like memories. You soak 'em long enough, they'll keep forever." You nod, slowly. Historians still argue whether medieval pickling was mostly about preservation or preference. Many argue both. After all, pickling turned perishables into prestige, lemons from abroad, artichokes in oil, tiny green strawberries sealed in rosewater and vinegar. You move on to eggs dyed with onion skins and spiced with clove. They look like marbled stones. One batch has been pickled so long, it's practically a fossil. You bite one. It tastes like time and a little regret. Not bad, honestly. In the corner, a pickling apprentice is sealing a jar with wax. He hums an off-key ballad about a forbidden cucumber. You pretend not to hear the verse involving a bishop and a jar of dill. Eventually, the steward returns. "Enough vinegar for now," he says, gesturing for you to follow. "It's nearly noon. We test the pies." You blink. "The next feast?" you ask, Cautiously hopeful, he's joking. He shakes his head. This one was only the autumnal preview. Winter's Fest begins next week. You smile and follow. Back upstairs, the test kitchen is alive again. Cooks move with purpose, sleeves rolled, brows furrowed in delicious concentration. You spot a half-carved swan mold on one table and a vat of chestnut cream on another. A blackboard lists names like Tart of Mystery and Pie of Seven Sorrows. You're handed a spoon. Someone lifts a lid. Steam billows upward, fragrant and unfamiliar. "It's eel again," a cook says apologetically, "but festive this time." You take a bite. To your surprise, it is festive. Cloves, lemon zest, a crust that shatters like a delicate promise, somehow both odd and celebratory, like a wedding between opposites. You nod approval. The cook beams. Next comes a sweet, pear slices poached in red wine and arranged to look like a dragon mid-yawn. Then a cheese tart with a crust laced in rosemary. Then a pudding encased in amber sugar that requires a mallet and a strong moral compass to crack open. You try them all. Because this, you've learned, is how you honor a feast, not just by eating, but by witnessing the weird, wild, wonderful work that goes into it. You're not just digesting anymore. You're participating. And when the jester walks in, wearing 2 ladles as antlers and proclaims himself the Duke of Brine, you rise and bow respectfully. Because here, even absurdity has its place.
Later that afternoon, you find yourself in the parchment room. Yes, parchment. Because every dish served at these grand feasts, every hedgehog pie, every swan tongue canapé, every sugar saint who lost a head to clumsy forks, gets recorded. The chronicler is a woman with ink-stained fingers, 3 ink pots arranged like a sacred triangle, and a look that suggests she has seen things: custard explosions, cake revolts, the infamous jelly collapse of St. Basil's Eve. She motions for you to sit. On the desk before her is a massive ledger. Its pages are thick, its edges slightly sticky. You recognize some of the entries from your own feast. Others you hope never to meet. She dips a quill and begins to dictate. "Course 6, she murmurs, trotters in beer glaze. One countess attempted a pun, was ignored. You stifle a laugh. This, you realize, is the true record-keeping. Not kings and wars and treaties, but who brought the wrong sauce and how many guests fainted politely into their puddings. She lets you try an entry. You take the quill, hesitate, then write, "Course 10, hedgehog pies. Surprisingly moving. One guest wept. No one questioned it." The chronicler reads it, then gives you a solemn nod. Honest, poetic, bit heavy on hedgehog pathos, but that's common among new scribes. You smile, ink blotting the edge of your sleeve. Historians still argue whether such feast records were accurate menus or embroidered memory. Many combine fact and fiction so seamlessly that modern scholars find themselves reconstructing entire banquets from rumor and gravy-stained scrolls. You glance around the room. Shelves groan under the weight of gastronomic legacy, piles of parchment scrolls bound in ribbon, some sprouting sticky tabs labeled "Don't Serve Again." One is sealed with wax and marked "Too weird, even for us." You want desperately to read it, but instead, the chronicler pulls a smaller book from the bottom shelf. This one is different, bound in red leather, smaller, personal. "This," she whispers, "is the guest book." She opens it, revealing pages filled with notes from previous attendees. Some are poetic, some are absurd, some are barely legible, written clearly under the influence of mulled wine and metaphysical cheese. You're handed a quill again. You think. Then you write, "I arrived curious. I leave full. Of food, and of everything I didn't know I needed." You cap the ink.
The chronicler smiles, and just like that, you're part of the archive. Your belly isn't the only thing that's full. So is the record. So is the story. You stand, stretch, and prepare to leave the parchment room. As you reach the door, she calls after you. "We'll be testing jelly tomorrow." You nod solemnly. "I'll bring my boots." Outside, the light is dimming. Evening slides in, soft and slow like a velvet cloak. You wander the hall once more. Some guests are already arriving for the next event. Yes, another feast. Yes, again. Apparently the Baroness from across the river has brought her personal goose choir and insists on debuting her famous 6-layered trout surprise. You are not emotionally prepared for trout surprises. But you'll go anyway, because here, food isn't just sustenance. It's memory. It's ritual. It's art that you can chew, swallow, and remember in your bones. You head back to your room briefly, passing a window streaked with evening rain. The clouds are the color of overcooked custard, and you are the color of contentment.
Your room smells faintly of beeswax and yesterday's lavender. A small loaf of bread, wrapped in linen and tied with twine, sits on your bedside table with a note, "In case of midnight regret." You pat it gently and whisper, "Not yet." You lie back for a moment, listening to the soft patter of rain. Outside, the Baroness's goose choir is warming up, gentle honks echoing like a very confused cathedral. Then comes the knock. It's the steward. Not with another course, with a scroll. "We're looking for judges," he says, "for the pie debate." You sit up instantly. "Pie debate?" He nods. Sweet versus savory, an ancient tension. Moments later, you're seated once more at a long, narrow table in a smaller chamber called the Parlor of Crumbs. Across from you sits a knight with plum jam on his tunic and a very serious glint in his eye. Next to you, a nun, sharpening a dessert fork with dramatic flair. The steward places 2 pies before each judge. One is meat, boar, onion, rosemary, possibly shame. The other is fruit, pear, quince, and something labeled mystery syrup. You taste both. The savory is rich, warm, grounding, a pie you could build a small emotional fort in. The sweet is vibrant, tinged with clove and regret, like a joyful childhood you didn't quite have. You chew, you ponder, you sip water and whisper, "This is harder than it looks." Historians still argue whether pies were born out of necessity, luxury, or sheer spite. In medieval kitchens, crusts weren't just edible, they were architecture. A pie was a container, a statement, and occasionally a prison for unsuspecting birds. You cast your vote, both. A murmur of approval runs down the line. The nun raises her fork in solemn solidarity. The steward smiles. A vote for balance, a classic. To celebrate the indecision, another pie is served. This one half and half, with a braided crust acting as a delicious border between worlds. It's called the Treaty of Tarts. You eat it reverently. Later, guests gather for what the steward calls digestive entertainments. It includes a puppet show reenacting the Battle of the Bread Puddings, a musical trio performing a ballad called Ode to an Overripe Fig, and a surprisingly emotional reading of a cheese inventory from 1374. You are once again delighted and confused. Someone hands you a candied violet. You nibble it and find it tastes like crushed spring and modest ambition. Outside, the rain slows to a drizzle. Someone opens a window and cool air slips in, mixing with the warmth of cinnamon and wax. You lean back, close your eyes, float. Feasts like these aren't about hunger, they're about celebration.
of harvests, of absurdity, of staying awake long enough to laugh at your own fullness. You hear a lute, you hear geese, you hear your own sigh, deep, round, and baked at 375 degrees for 45 minutes. And as the steward passes once more, muttering about the midnight stew, you realize you'll follow wherever this strange, delicious path leads.
The midnight stew is not a myth, it is very real. You discover this when you are gently nudged awake by the sound of quiet clattering and the unmistakable aroma of something bubbling low and slow, an aroma that whispers, "Yes, you're full, but wouldn't you like one more spoonful?" You follow the scent down a side hallway, barefoot and blanket draped like a wandering monk of appetite. Other guests shuffle alongside you, equally dazed, drawn by some ancient gravitational pull only stew possesses. In the kitchen hearth, a black cauldron simmers. The cook stirs with a wooden paddle that looks like it might have once been used in a rowing competition. The stew inside is dark, glossy, and smells of onion, mushroom, and memory. "This one," she murmurs, "has everything that didn't make the cut." You glance inside. There are scraps of roasted root vegetables, a hint of smoked pheasant, shreds of herbs, whispers of cheese, rogue lentils. It's the edible afterparty of the entire feast. Someone hands you a bowl. You sit on a stool. You sip. It is glorious. Not because it's fancy, but because it isn't. It's honest. The kind of food that tells you it's okay to be tired. Each spoonful is like a lullaby sung in broth. Historians still argue whether midnight stews were intentional or simply kitchen improvisations. Some believe they were rituals for staff alone, those who cooked but rarely ate at the high table. Others suggest they were acts of hospitality for lingering guests, unwilling to surrender to sleep. Either way, they mattered. You notice the cook ladling stew into bowls not just for humans, but for the 3 cats curled by the hearth. She whispers their names like blessings: thyme, clove, and regret. Only regret bites. You finish your stew slowly, soaking the last broth with a crust of leftover oat bread. Around you, the conversation is hushed and warm, memories of the feast shared like bedtime stories. One guest swears the pudding winked at him. Another reveals she stole a sugar saint and named him Clarence. Someone is composing a haiku about cheese. The steward arrives, not to interrupt, but to sit. He accepts the bowl without a word and eats it with the expression of a man who's seen 17 feasts and lived to tell their most fragrant truths. Afterward, a few guests drift back to rooms, others stretch out by the fire. You stay a while longer, watching the coals fade from flame to glow. The cook hums as she cleans. You recognize the tune, something that Jester sang earlier about pudding diplomacy. You rise, return to your room. The tiny bread loaf still waits, untouched. You pat it fondly and whisper, "Still not yet." Then you lie down, the stew's warmth still blooming in your belly. Outside, the rain has finally stopped. A sliver of moonlight slices across the floorboards, and as you drift back to sleep, this time for real, you think to yourself, there's something sacred about being fed well. Not just full, fed well. The next morning greets you not with trumpets, but with birdsong. Gentle, warbling notes that float in through the window and land on your pillow like tiny, feathery alarms. You stretch, yawn, check your pockets for leftover raisins, find none. Tragedy. But there is movement outside. Curious, you wrap your cloak around yourself and wander back toward the hall, only to find it transformed once more.
Gone are the jester's ribbons, the garlands of sugared ivy, the discarded crusts of poetic pies. In their place, long wooden benches, empty platters, and a quiet, industrious energy. The hall is being reset. But not for another feast, for something simpler. Inventory day. You approach cautiously. The steward waves you in. "We count the spoons," he says solemnly. And indeed, the counting is already underway. A long ledger is open across a table, filled with neat columns labeled things like copper ladles, surviving pewter forks, unexplained truffles, and mischievous cheese rinds. You are handed a basket. "You're on ginger," the cook says. You blink. "All of it?" She nods. "Fresh, dried, crystallized, smuggled in via boot." So you begin. Ginger root in baskets, ginger slices in wax paper, ginger candies wrapped in foil that somehow survived 3 monarchs and an ill-advised duel. You line them up, count carefully, taste one, immediately regret it. Too much spice. You nod in respect. Historians still argue whether such inventories were formal rituals or just the kitchen's way of restoring sanity. Some records suggest entire days devoted to spice auditing, especially after feasts involving nobility and their notoriously generous seasoning habits. You find a tiny jar labeled "Regretfully Experimental Ginger Confit, 1341. It rattles when shaken. You leave it alone. Elsewhere in the room, others count raisins, lemons, mint leaves. One poor soul is tasked with tracking the fate of all edible gold leaf. His face is pure despair. You pass a monk meticulously weighing wheels of cheese on a scale made from bones and hope. He mutters, 3 missing. Possibly eaten. Possibly abducted. You suggest checking under the table. He gasps, finds one, weeps with gratitude. It is, unexpectedly, one of the most touching moments of your life. Around midday, the atmosphere softens. The counting slows. Laughter rises again, quiet but genuine. Someone begins sketching a caricature of the steward made entirely of forks. Another composes a limerick involving a walnut and an existential crisis. Lunch is simple. Thick slices of brown bread, sharp cheese, stewed apples, and a pot of tea so strong it could resuscitate the dead. You eat gratefully, because today is not about indulgence. It's about remembering what's left, what remains. The feast fades, but these jars, these scraps, these scribbled notes in the ledger are the echo. They're the story that stays after the pudding's gone. You feel a small pang in your chest. Not sadness, just fullness of a different kind. The kind that lingers. Like ginger.
By late afternoon, the sun slants low across the flagged stone floor, casting long shadows from stacks of crockery and towers of empty trenchers. The feast has well and truly passed, but its echoes still cling to the corners of the castle like a good broth to the sides of a pot. And today, you are told, is the day of complaints. You blink. Yes, complaints. Not because the feast went poorly, no, quite the opposite. But tradition insists that every great banquet must be followed by the ceremonial airing of grievances,
just in case anything was less than transcendently perfect. You're handed a quill and a scroll titled The Register of Slight Culinary Inconveniences, and then you're left alone in a small chamber with a plate of apple slices and a tiny bell to ring if you remember something very serious, like an over-salted almond or a pudding that looked at you funny. You nibble an apple. You think. And you begin to write. At course 3, the truffled parsnips were a touch melancholic in tone. Course 5's eel pastry made me question my emotional boundaries. The sugar statue of Saint Veronica did not capture her cheekbones accurately. The cheese board came too late. I had already emotionally moved on. A scribe collects your scroll without judgment. Elsewhere, others are doing the same. A nobleman complains that his spoon was too shiny and it reflected his insecurities. A baroness claims the mulled wine was too introspective. Someone files an official objection to the bread rolls being too spiritually filling. Historians still argue whether these complaint rituals were sincere critiques or elaborate satire. Records suggest that nobles once held entire tournaments of grievance where the most poetically petty complaint won a decorative radish. You would like a decorative radish. Instead, you are given a small badge reading "The Wit of the Buttered Tongue" and a wink from the steward. Later, the complaints are read aloud by the jester, who delivers them with such theatrical gravitas that guests weep with laughter. One complaint, about figs that felt emotionally distant, causes a bishop to choke on a nutmeg wafer. In this, too, there is a kind of closure. The feast is remembered, reviewed, laughed about, and finally released. That evening, you take a slow walk around the outer grounds. The wind is cool, the sky turning the color of elderberry jam. You pass the herb garden where a single chicken stares at you with unsettling wisdom. You nod. The chicken blinks. Somewhere near the stables, a young cook is teaching the geese to bow. It's going poorly. You sit on a bench shaped like a hollowed-out turnip, don't ask, and reflect. Feasts aren't just about food, you realize again. They're about after the food. The shared memories, the whispered jokes, the bonding over shared indigestion. It's in the sighs, the laughter, the exaggerated groans of "I'll never eat again," followed 30 minutes later by "Is that stew?" You exhale deeply. The last of the feast lingers in your breath like smoke from a remembered fire. And tomorrow? Tomorrow begins planning for the spring feast. But tonight, just tonight, it is enough to sit with your belly quiet, your heart full, and your mind tasting the shadows of honey and thyme.
Night falls again, soft and deliberate, wrapping the castle in a cloak of slow, contented silence. But this isn't the silence of absence, it's the silence of digestion, reflection, and pie-induced enlightenment. The steward appears once more, this time with a lantern and a peculiar gleam in his eye. "Come," he says, "it's time for the relic walk." You do not question him. You never question a man holding a lantern and smelling faintly of cumin. He leads you down a spiral staircase, deeper than you've ever ventured in the castle, past cellars, past spice vaults, past the corridor of forgotten jams. Finally, you reach a small chamber, candlelit and reverent. In the center, a pedestal. On the pedestal, a pie. Not a fresh pie, not even an edible pie. This is the relic pie. Encased in glass, yellowed and cracked like ancient parchment, it bears a small plaque, the last surviving gooseberry tart of the feast of 1329. You gasp. So does everyone else. You are not alone. Other guests file in quietly, all in night robes and various states of crumb-dotted awe. The steward clears his throat. Each year we honor this pie, not for flavor, but for memory, for enduring when even the strongest stomach could not, for being forgotten and then exalted. A hush. You approach the glass. The tart is crusty, withered, noble. One guest begins to cry. Someone else kneels. The jester attempts to sing a hymn, but is gently shushed. Historians still argue whether relic pies like this were actual culinary accidents or intentional artifacts meant to carry flavor memory across generations. Some accounts mention pies buried ceremonially, others displayed like saints. This one is rumored to have been lost for centuries in the castle rafters and discovered by a bat with exquisite taste. You're handed a candle. Everyone is. And slowly, silently, you begin to walk in a circle around the tart. It is absurd. It is profound. It is everything a medieval banquet should be, over the top, oddly reverent, and just a little bit sticky. After the 7th lap, the steward concludes the ceremony with a whisper. May our future pies be worthy. You nod, and in that moment, you believe. Back in your room, the bread is still there. You finally eat it. It tastes like quiet and the end of things. You lie back, candle flickering low, and you wonder, centuries from now, will someone display your feast? Will they honor your bite of hedgehog pie, your comment about introspective wine? Maybe not, but that's okay, because the memory lives in your belly, and your belly never forgets.
The next morning comes not with birdsong, but with the sharp thwack of a ladle striking a pot. Up, someone shouts. It's bread day. You sit bolt upright. Bread day? You dress faster than a pastry undercooked in a hurry. Down the stairs, past the now silent feasting hall, into the courtyard, where a fire crackles in a massive outdoor oven that looks like it was built to roast dragons, or, at the very least, very large loaves. Cooks bustle about with baskets of flour, jugs of milk, bowls of honey. One tosses a handful of sesame seeds in the air like confetti. Another slaps dough against a marble counter to the beat of a chant that sounds suspiciously like a baking spell. Today, the steward says solemnly, handing you a lump of dough, we need our regrets. You look down at your dough. You think of the 3rd slice of sugar tart you maybe didn't need, the jug of mead you drank because someone dared you, the moment you locked eyes with a pudding and flinched. You press. You fold. You knead like your conscience depends on it. A monk beside you mutters quiet confessions into his rye loaf. A noblewoman sculpts her dough into the shape of a swan. You make a blob, but a very heartfelt blob. Historians still argue whether bread day was a real tradition or a clever way to use up leftover yeast and shame. Some documents hint at communal baking as a form of gentle penance, a post-feast purge of both pantry and soul. Once the dough is shaped and rising, you're invited to participate in the butter blessing. You don't know what that means until you're handed a stick of butter carved with tiny, elaborate runes. You whisper a wish into it. You choose fewer eel pies, then place it beside your bread to bake together. The cook nods approvingly. May your crust be golden and your crumbs be few. It is the highest compliment you have received all week. While the bread bakes, there are games, flour sack races, crumb counting contests, an impromptu competition called Yeast or Beast that no one fully understands but everyone enjoys. You watch as the jester juggles 3 baguettes while reciting a love poem to a sourdough starter named Beatrice. Then the bread comes out. The smell is transcendental. Warm, sweet, crackling crusts and steam that curls like a blessing from a flowery saint. You break your blob loaf open. It's slightly lopsided, vaguely sad-looking, but undeniably yours. You slather it with honey. Take a bite. It tastes like forgiveness, like possibility, like everything the feast has built up to and everything it's winding down from. You sit on the grass, chewing slowly, eyes closed. The feast, in many ways, is over. But the bread? The bread is what stays. What travels home in pockets, what's shared with neighbors, what sits on the shelf as a soft, quiet reminder, you were there. You feasted. You lived. And tomorrow, you may feast again. Or maybe you'll just make toast. Either way, you'll carry this, like a crust in your heart.
Later that day, just when you think nothing else could possibly surprise you, the steward appears again, clutching what can only be described as a feast map. Unfurling it with dramatic flair, he taps a tiny symbol shaped like a drumstick and declares, "The leftover hunt begins now." You stare. The what? He grins. You heard me. Somewhere across these grounds are fragments of the feast, forgotten, misplaced, or strategically hidden. Find them, return them, taste at your own risk. A bell rings. Guests scatter. You hesitate only a moment before grabbing a small satchel, a wooden spoon for defense, and a strong moral compass, borrowed from the monk with the cheese scale. Thus begins your journey into the culinary wilderness. You start in the orchard, where the scent of overripe pears leads you to a butter-wrapped tart wedged between 2 branches. It's half-eaten, disturbingly warm, and yet you take a bite. Bold, sticky, possibly cursed. You move on. Behind the stables, you find a crustless pie tucked into a hay bale like a delicious message from a carb-loving squirrel. Inside, quince and turnip. Surprisingly harmonious. You write a haiku about it in your notebook. Turnip, soft and sly. Quince, like sun in autumn fog. Who hurt you, and why? Next is the chapel. You pause at the altar, but the only relic here is a long-forgotten fig stuffed with almond paste, perched on the armrest of a pew like a sugary sentinel. Historians still argue whether leftover hunts were real or apocryphal. Some call them ritualized scavenger games designed to teach gratitude. Others say it was just a chaotic way to make sure nothing spoiled behind the curtains. You find evidence for both. Under a tapestry, you discover an entire roast quail wrapped in lace. Inside the jester's hat, 3 sugared hazelnuts and a note reading, "Don't ask." Behind a loose stone in the wall, a scroll titled, "List of Desserts That Got Away." You return to the hall with your spoils. The steward records each item in a ledger labeled "Fugitives and Foundlings." You receive a medal in the shape of a lemon wedge. It's labeled "Sour but Loyal." The remaining leftovers are assembled into a massive platter called the End Feast. It's chaotic. Sweet beside salty, roast beside jam, confused sauces mingling like shy party guests. You sit, you eat, and you laugh harder than you have all week, because this is the most human part of it all. The messy, delicious aftermath, the not quite right pairings, the fragments, the remainders that still deserve to be tasted, remembered, adored. You lick your fingers, you pat your belly, and as you leave the table, someone presses a folded parchment into your hand. It reads, "You are now an honorary keeper of the feast." You do not take this lightly. You will carry it home, like breadcrumbs through memory.
The castle grows quieter now. Gone is the riot of clinking cutlery and pudding applause. The banners are down. The candle stubs tell their final smoky stories. Even the jester walks slower, like a man who has finally run out of rhymes for marzipan. But before guests depart, there is one final ritual, the Feast of Words. You were led to a low, round chamber deep within the keep. Its walls are covered in scrolls, some pristine, others splashed with wine or singed at the edges. A long table sits in the center, not for eating, but for writing. Quills await. You're given a seat, a blank page, and a warm cup of spiced milk that tastes like nostalgia and cloves. "Write what you remember," says the steward. "Not the dishes, the moments." So you begin. The hedgehog pie that made the night weep. The pudding that looked like a saint but tasted like sin. The moment the cheese scale found justice. The bread that forgave you. The stew that sang lullabies. The relic pie and its mournful crust. The sighs, the jokes, the jellied revelations. Others write too. Some in poems, some in lists. One guest is sketching a comic strip about an eel with ambition. Historians still argue whether these written recollections were ever archived or just burned to scent the next feast's fire. But fragments survive, etched into travelogues, tucked into the margins of sermons, whispered in footnotes like breadcrumbs for future dreamers. When your scroll is full, you place it on the stack and seal it with a stamp that reads simply, "Tasted and true." You linger. Then, at last, you rise. Guests are packing. The geese are quiet. Even the stew pot has been scrubbed clean, a humble monument to 100 late-night spoonfuls. You wander back to your room one final time. On the pillow, a satchel of herbs, a note that reads, "To carry the scent of feast home." And because fate is hilarious, the tiny bread you left uneaten, now hard as philosophy. You smile, you pack, and as you step out into the morning light, the castle behind you exhales. You carry nothing extravagant, just a scroll, a story, a memory that tastes of time, laughter, and something slightly burnt. And somewhere deep inside, where belly meets heart, you know you'll return, not to this feast, but to another, because the table is eternal, and the story never quite ends. The journey home begins on foot, because of course it does. Carriages are too fast, too final. You need time to let it all settle, the flavors, the laughter, the slow ceremonial rhythm of a week spent living by spoon and candlelight. You trudge along a winding path lined with blackberry brambles and the occasional pastry wrapper fluttering in the breeze like a flag of post-feast survival. A fellow guest walks beside you for a while, a quiet bard who says nothing but occasionally hums a tune you recognize from the bread day games. You nod to each other in that sacred way travelers do, bonded forever by shared stew and synchronized bloating. You pass a brook. It smells faintly of rosemary. A frog leaps across your path, croaking in a tone that could only mean too much fig. You nod again. You feel seen. Further along, you find a roadside shrine, not to a saint, to a pie. It's shaped in stone, lattice-topped, flaky glory. The inscription reads, "Here lies the memory of flavor." You leave behind one of your last candied hazelnuts in offering. A breeze lifts your cloak. The world is bigger out here, but it feels smaller too now that you've tasted it with such attention. Historians still argue whether returning from a feast changed people or merely reminded them who they were. Some accounts describe guests weeping at the sight of ordinary bread or suddenly composing limericks about barley mid-bathing. You understand now. The feast lingers, not in your teeth, though maybe a little there, but in your gestures. The slower way you breathe, the sudden urge to thank the earth every time you smell cinnamon. Eventually, you stop at a village inn. The keeper welcomes you with a simple meal, broth, bread, and pickled onions. You eat it slowly, not because you're hungry, but because you know how rare it is to eat mindfully. You compliment the broth. The keeper beams. You say it reminds you of stew blessed by candlelight. She doesn't understand, but she smiles anyway. That night, in a small bed with 2 flat pillows, you sleep like a legend. You dream of tart duels and cheese trials, of pie relics and bread forgiveness, of the way every spoonful carried with it not just flavor, but intention. And when you wake, just before dawn, there's a rooster crowing and a plate of scones waiting by your door. One has been nibbled by a mouse. You feel honored and full in all the ways that matter.
A few weeks pass. The feast has ended, yes, but the world around you seems ever so slightly seasoned. You find yourself smelling bread before biting it, holding spoons with reverence, saying thank you to your meals aloud, even when dining alone, especially when dining alone. You catch a whiff of nutmeg on the breeze one afternoon and pause, eyes closed, waiting for a memory to bloom. It does. It's a mental image of the nun sharpening her dessert fork. You chuckle. A man walking his goose gives you a strange look. You don't care. One morning, while dusting your shelves, you discover the tiny scroll of parchment you brought home, the one with your official title, Honorary Keeper of the Feast. You frame it, hang it proudly beside the kitchen hearth. Below it, you place a single candlestick, a wooden spoon, and a tin of pickled something that's probably legal to eat. You begin journaling your meals, not in calories or macros, but in moments. Today, I ate stew while listening to rain. It tasted like patience. Historians still argue whether post-feast rituals were forms of nostalgia, community maintenance, or low-grade culinary obsession. Some even suggest guests formed secret societies devoted to perfecting bread crusts and identifying the emotional notes of mustard. You believe them. You find yourself adopting feast habits elsewhere. You start blessing your lunch cheese. You hum during soup stirring.
You label your leftovers as Act 2. One day, a child asks, "What makes your bread so good?" You answer, "I knead my regrets into it." The child nods solemnly and backs away. Another evening, you host a dinner for friends. It's not elaborate, just lentils, root vegetables, and a modest tart. But you light candles. You serve the soup from a ladle carved with tiny stars. You read aloud from your Feast of Words scroll, and afterward your guests sit in silence for a moment, before someone says, "That was lovely." You smile. Not because they liked the meal, but because they understood it was more than a meal. They understood you'd carried the feast home. Not in your bag, not in your belly, but in your being.
The seasons shift. Leaves gold themselves. Rain hums at the window. You begin to crave warm things. Stews, soft wool, stories repeated for the 100th time. You tuck yourself into the rhythm of days and nights. And yet, one morning, you wake with a craving. Not hunger, a craving. You rummage through your pantry. Oats? No. Cheese? Not quite. Jam? Closer. Then you spot it, the wrapped satchel of herbs gifted to you on the final night of the feast. You open it. The scent carries you back. Bread day, the relic pie, the pudding duel where the bishop wept. You smile, and you know exactly what you need to do. You set about planning a modest banquet. Not a royal affair, just a gathering of a few like-hearted friends, lovers of slow spoons and crumbed conversation. You make invitations on scraps of parchment, sealed with melted candle wax and a raisin for flair. The menu? Potato soup that forgives all sins, walnut bread that cracks like a wise joke, a roasted root vegetable dish you name unnecessary pilgrimage, and a fig tart so crooked and proud it could pass as a local legend. You decorate with pine cones and dry citrus slices and a garland made from your old grocery list. Historians still argue whether medieval feasts inspired the idea of domestic ritual, little acts of celebration in homes not built for trumpets. But you've come to believe feasts weren't just about grandeur, they were about attention. You set the table with care, you hum, your guests arrive, they're delighted by everything, especially the pudding shaped like a confused squirrel. You share stories from the original feast. You pass the wooden spoon from person to person, each sharing their own food memory. It becomes a sort of ceremony, an accidental tradition. At one point, you notice someone sitting silently, eyes closed, holding their bowl like a relic. You ask what they're thinking. They say, "I didn't know soup could feel like a story." You nod. Later, as guests depart, one slips you a note. It reads, "That was the first time I've felt full in weeks." You save it. Pin it beside your Keeper of the Feast badge. You lie in bed that night, hands folded over a stomach both content and overworked. And as you drift toward sleep, you whisper one final toast to yourself, to flavors that linger and stories that rise like bread.
The world, it turns out, keeps feasting, quietly, perpetually, in kitchens you'll never see, around tables you'll never sit. But you carry your own small banquet now, tucked into the folds of memory, wrapped in napkins of soft laughter and warm broth. Tonight, As rain taps gently against the window, you return one last time in thought. You remember the flicker of candlelight on glossy goose fat, the moment you bit into a pie and tasted poetry, the laughter that erupted when someone accidentally sat on a candied pheasant, the reverence of the relic pie, the joy of the leftover hunt, the unexpected grace of a bread day confession. It all lingers, not in spectacle, but in quiet repetition. You stir your stew a little slower now. You bless the salt before tossing it in. You catch yourself sniffing cloves and smiling. And every so often, when the moment is just right, you hum an old chant about yeast and sorrow. Historians may never fully agree on what feasts meant in medieval times, but you know they were more than indulgence. They were a kind of hopeful defiance, a reminder that life, fragile, fleeting, chaotic, still deserved flavor, still deserved joy. Tonight, you write one final entry in your scroll. I was there. I ate. I laughed. I remembered. And then, like any good host, you begin to clean the corners of your thoughts, tucking away scraps of memory for another night, another story, another soft drift into dreams. Because now, at last, it's time to let the flavors fade and the silence bloom. So now, as you lie back, still and full, and perhaps a little sleepy, let the memory of those far-off feasts settle over you like a soft linen blanket. Let the bread be warm again in your hands. Let the honey glisten once more in your memory. Let the flickering light of long-ago candles cast slow shadows on the banquet walls of your mind. Breathe in deeply. Perhaps you still smell rosemary and ash, or a ghost of ginger wafting through time. Exhale gently, as if releasing the final crumbs of a very good day. All those strange moments, the goose debates, the pudding duels, the confessions to cheese, can rest now. You've carried them far. You've tasted what you were meant to taste. You've remembered, and in doing so, you've feasted again. There's nothing else to do tonight. No more courses to serve, no more bread to break. Only this, soft, dark, gentle hum, the quiet comfort of a story told and retold until it glows in the dusk of your thoughts. So let it go. Let the flavors fade. Let the laughter dim into silence. And with one last sigh, deeper than broth and sweeter than marzipan, drift gently, drift slowly, drift peacefully into sleep.